Oh, reason not the need. Man's life is cheap as beasts. You heavens, give me the patience. Patience I need. You see me here, you gods, a poor old man, as full of grief as age, wretched in both. If it be you that stirs these daughters' hearts against their father, fool me not so much to bear it tamely. Touch me with noble anger, and let not women's weapons water drops stain my man's cheeks. You think I'll weep? No, I'll not weep. I'll have full cause of weeping, but this heart shall break into 100,000 flaws ere I'll weep, fool. So thus proclaims King Lear as he comes face to face with his folly after he has divided his kingdom into two parts between his daughters, Goneril and Regan. And they strip him of his privileges and cast him out into the storm in their grab for power, Luke. Here we are in our next episode of Fathers and Sons, and we're talking Shakespeare today and King Lear, one of the greatest works of drama in English and probably any language, and obviously one of the saddest as well. I mean, this is actually, for me, pretty hard to read over the last couple of weeks. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I am of the opinion that Shakespeare wrote longer plays and maybe more complex ones, but I do not think there is a single other play of his that is as emotionally taxing as this one. And you can kind of see that in the different portrayals. For our listeners, we've both recently watched a version of this play. I watched the Amazon Prime version with some pretty major headliners, Anthony Hopkins in the titular role, and I think you watched the Ian McKellen version.
Yeah, I did.
They're pretty different, and then we both read slightly different versions as well. But yeah, this play, no matter which way you slice it, is heavy and it's
Yeah,
hard.
yeah. And it's just sad.
Yeah, it's just sad. It's heartbreaking.
Well, it's
It's
tragic. It's a
yeah,
tragedy, right? It's one of Shakespeare's tragedies, and it sort of demonstrates Shakespeare's tragic genius. And we're using tragedy in a very specific sense here. It outlines a fatal flaw in the main character and in a number of the characters, pretty much all the
uh-huh.
characters, right? There is a realization of the fatal flaw at a point in the plot where it is eternally too late for Lear. And there's no spoilers here. You ought to know the plot of a Shakespeare tragedy before you read it or watch it. So there's a realization, sort of a catharsis and a realization of the fatal flaw, but it's too late for him to fix it. And then unavoidable suffering that leads to basically that ends in death for the main character and a number of the other characters that you come to care about in the plot. We're going to look at King Lear because it's not about father and sons, it's about father and daughters. There are some father-sons relationships. We'll also talk about there's a subplot about the Earl of Gloucester that we'll talk about maybe briefly, but we'll talk about a few of the things that, that Lear treats. Abdication of a father's role. We'll talk maybe a little bit about unconditional love. And then there's this famous plot device, the love test. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Expectations of familial duty. Like, what do we expect of each other in a family? Is there ever a time when it's okay to walk away from those duties? Honesty versus sort of appearance. And like, when should you be honest and when should you sort of kind of go along to get along? Knowing ourselves as fathers, especially with adult children and like knowing our limitations, parenting adult children. And there's probably a few other themes that may come up. Maybe we won't even get to all that because it's pretty long.
Yep.
So that's
Yeah,
kind of the intro. I think we probably do need maybe a bit of an overview of the plot just for listeners who maybe haven't read it ever or who haven't read it since they were in college.
definitely. And I can do that. We'll put maybe a link in the description to the versions that we read.
Yeah.
I've got my big old Norton anthology here
Yeah,
with all the works of Shakespeare.
for the viewers, here's my Royal Shakespeare Company version with some tabs in it. Yeah.
We're big fans, Shakespeare fans
I
from the get-go.
also read this Folger. I was on a trip for part of the time. I didn't wanna lug my big one, so I also
Yeah,
bought this for, like, $6 on Amazon, and I read
nice.
this.
So I'll maybe give some background on the versions in a sec, but to start with, plot of King Lear, it's basically two stories at the same time, parallel stories of two families who are ultimately destroyed and rendered kind of almost non-existent because of the fatal flaws that you mentioned before. Starts out with Lear, who is a mythical figure actually in kind of English and British history. But Lear, the King of England, the King of Bretonia, who is retiring from his kingship, and he's partitioning, dividing his kingdom amongst his three daughters: Cordelia, who's the youngest; Regan, who's the middle daughter; and Goneril, who's the oldest. And he's dividing this sort of based off of his preferences. There's some things at the beginning that indicate that Cordelia is his favorite daughter, and he's giving her the best part. But he's also doing so based off of a public declaration of their love. He asks each of his daughters to tell him how much they love him before he gives them their dowry, essentially. He also wants to retain 100 knights to himself. So he's giving up rule of the kingdom, but he wants to keep his retinue, and he wants to keep the title of king. Says very specifically he will still be king. Now, Goneril and Regan are married. Goneril is married to the Duke of Albany, who's kind of a more of a sympathetic figure, and Regan is married to the Duke of Cornwall, who is a bad dude. He is not a good guy. It'll get a little confusing in there, but we can go back over the characters. And Cordelia is not married, but she's being wooed by the Duke of Burgundy and the King of France. So the three daughters are asked to proclaim their love. Goneril and Regan both do so, and they say very specifically that they love their father more than anything else. They have no room in their hearts for any other person besides Lear. He loves it. He gives them their dowry. They're, happy, or whatever their version of happy is. But Cordelia refuses to participate and speaks more honestly and says that she loves him as a daughter should love their father, but no more and no less. Now, Lear, and we'll talk about this, but he does not react well. He banishes Cordelia. The King of France ends up marrying her out of respect and love because he likes that she's been honest, and kind of we'll talk about that as well. But she leaves court, and King Lear goes to live with his other daughters, Goneril and Regan, kind of switching back and forth between the two of them. Now, there's also the Earl of Kent, who we won't probably talk about as much, but he is a major figure. He's sort of like Lear's right hand man, it seems, has always been very loyal. But he speaks up in defense of Cordelia, and he is exiled as well. He comes back in disguise throughout the play and plays a pivotal role. Now, there's a subplot involving the Earl of Gloucester and his two sons, Edgar, who's his legitimate heir, and Edmund, who is illegitimate and not his heir. And Edmund is kind of the antagonist, the primary antagonist, although all of the characters are somewhat antagonistic. Now, as the play progresses, Goneril and Regan essentially reveal that they are terrible people. They humiliate Lear, they take away his knights. Eventually, their treatment of him leads him to, it's up for debate, but either he casts himself out or they cast him out into a storm in the middle of the night. And he chooses madness and exile over the treatment he's received at the hands of his daughters. Now, his fool, the Earl of Kent, and Edgar, the legitimate son of the Earl of Gloucester, accompany him, and they kind of wander around until Cordelia returns as the Queen of France at the head of an army.
Let's just
And they,
just real quick,
yeah, go ahead.
his fool, when you mention his fool, this is like a court jester,
Right.
and he has a pretty major role in the play, and as a truth teller. Cordelia, Kent, and then the fool are the only ones in the play who tell really the truth throughout.
Yeah.
And Cordelia and Kent are banished for it. The fool is not banished for it. The fool, because he is, the traditional sort of trope of the fool as being mentally disturbed or not competent. I mean, sometimes people that had, Down syndrome or other, kind of mental disabilities were cast in the role of the court jester. That's not how this particular fool is played in the play. He's actually very bright. He gets away with calling Lear out and telling truth to Lear throughout, which is very an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic throughout the play.
Yeah, great call out. And I apologize if I'm going on too quickly, but a
No, it's
lot to
good.
get through
It's
in the
good.
short amount of time. So Cordelia returns while her father is missing, essentially. He's wandering about in no man's land, and she is invading with her husband to return Lear to the throne. Goneril and Regan are deemed unfit as rulers, and so they try to put Lear back on the throne, but they lose. Their army's defeated, mostly because of some subterfuge by Edmund, the bastard. And Edmund is in the good graces of both Goneril and Regan, and he imprisons Lear and Cordelia.
Well, they both wanna kill their
Yes,
husbands and marry him.
they do. Edmund is I think they call him a fine specimen. He's very handsome, very charismatic. Anyway, so Cordelia and Lear are imprisoned. Kent is sort of unable to do anything. Gloucester at this point the Earl of Gloucester has been blinded. He's had his eyes gouged out, which I don't know about the version you watched, but the one I did, it was horrible.
Yeah.
And so all of the guys who are sort of either the truth tellers or the ones like Lear and Gloucester who have realized they were in the wrong, they've all been rendered ineffective. And the bad guys seem like they're about to win, and then they do. They kind of do. Everyone dies at the end. Goneril poisons Regan and then kills herself. Edmund is defeated actually in the end by Edgar in single combat. They fight, and Edgar, who's the legitimate son, kills Edmund, the illegitimate kind of bad guy. Gloucester dies from shock after learning that Edgar has been with him the whole time, which is another subplot. Cordelia is hanged, and Lear dies of his grief over her body. And
Yeah.
so we're left sort of like if you've read Hamlet, right? The war at the end of Hamlet, we're left in kind of this limbic, this kind of misty uncertainty about what's going to happen or what has happened. But all of the major players have died, essentially. And so with that,
Yeah. A couple of things. You mentioned, one thing you mentioned was that Lear, when he partitioned his kingdom amongst his two daughters, he was going to partition it three ways, but Cordelia refused to play the game, the love
uh-huh.
test. She refused to sort of publicly declare this sort of kind of grossly overstated, I love you more than the moon, I love you more than anything else. And she basically said, if they love you so much, how do they have husbands? How do they have any room in their heart for anything else? I'm not going to overstate my love. I love you. You're my father. I love you as much as my duty requires, but no more. He doesn't like that. So anyway, he partitions his kingdom. He abdicates his power, but then he wants to keep the trappings of his office. He wants to be called king, and he wants to keep these 100 knights. And his two daughters that do inherit the land basically go back on that deal and strip him of his retainers. And I think you kind of said, well, that was, they were evil, and they shouldn't have done that. There's a different argument there, right? Was Lear, did he sow the seeds of his own destruction and the destruction of his kingdom? Was he abdicating not only his sort of political rule, but was he abdicating improperly his parental role, his responsibilities? Was he trying to sort of have his cake and eat it too by giving up responsibility, but wanting to keep, the trappings of that responsibility? Was there something there, part of his fatal flaw? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think written up some notes, and one of the things that I mentioned, I think in my notes, is that there's a lot of scholarship on this play that talks about how Edmund, the illegitimate, Regan and Goneril are the way they are, which is to say, the bad guys, the antagonists, because of their parents. So are Regan and Goneril sort of these wicked sisters because of Lear, because of his treatment of them? So he does, your question I think has some different pieces to it, but one of the ways in which he abdicates his parental duties is he's just sort of monstrous to his daughters. I mean, the way he speaks to them, the very first example is when he banishes Cordelia. He tells her at the beginning that he loves her and that he thinks she's a wonderful person and she's his favorite. And then as soon as she disappoints him, he says, "As a stranger to my heart and me, hold thee from this forever." He basically tells her, "I never want to see you again."
Right.
And very simply because she refused to play his little game. And I mean, throughout the book, at one point, he curses Goneril with sterility.
Yeah.
He says, "I hope that you have dust in your womb." And he calls Regan, let me see if I can find it. He calls her a disease. He calls her a pustule,
A boil
like a
on my
boil.
flesh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just terrible to these women.
Yeah.
And they're terrible back, or at least the first two are, but there is a very strong argument to be made that he deserves the treatment that he's receiving.
Yeah.
We don't get the backstory, like, we don't know what their relationship was like prior to this, but either it was like this and he was always mean, or he has, like, in his old age, snapped, or something has happened and he's behaving in a manner, and his knights too, I think, is important. His knights are bad dudes. Like, they're rowdy, and they break things, and they take the generosity of the daughters for granted. So Lear, at the very, very least, he does abdicate his parental duties, his fatherly duties, in so much that he is just mean to them. He's
Yeah.
not a good guy.
Yeah. Well, so what are the lessons for, I mean, we've talked about this in episodes before.
Yeah.
The older we get, we go back to some of these stories we read as younger people. And when I first read or watched King Lear in college, I didn't identify so much with Lear, I don't think. If we had time, I'd tell you the story of when I actually read Lear for the first time and identified with Edmund, not so much being the sort of the evil bastard, but the opening soliloquy of Edmund, I think, is one of the greatest parts of
It's great.
Shakespeare. And I
Yeah.
had this great class where we read that and analyzed, and it was a defining moment in my academic career. But as
Mhm.
an older father, I of course am looking for lessons of sort of how to age gracefully as a father of adult children. What are the lessons there? As we try to transition from the rule giver, the dad, the mom, who, has the responsibility to make sure their kids do what's right, to the advisor, the guy who has no authority anymore. We
Yeah.
want to, of course, be treated with respect and listened to, but, you don't have to listen to me anymore. What are the lessons there?
Well, I read something in my Norton anthology. One of the questions that you had asked in a similar vein to this was whether or not this story would be any different in the absence of wealth and power. And I would add into that maybe some other things, whether or not this story would have been any different in other situations. Let me just read this to you. So it says, "But King Lear is emphatically not about ordinary circumstances, quiet compromises, and equilibrium. It is about a crisis in which latent contradictions become all too manifest, polite fictions give way to unbearable truths, and all veils are stripped away." Now, I'm going to suggest that the transition you just described, from hands-on active parent to maybe benched parent, parent in the kind of council like you were mentioning, is maybe one of those crises. It's one of those moments. It's not by any means the same scope as this, but it is a moment where you're passing on the burden of ruling the kingdom to some extent or another, right? And so it is a moment when these contradictions become manifest. Like, I'm a new parent and I am recognizing all of the times I lie to my daughter as a 3-year-old. And I'm recognizing that you guys lied to me as a kid all the time, but you taught me to be truthful, you know? And here's the thing, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but if we dig down in that quote a little bit more, I love this idea of the veils being stripped away. It's like suddenly you recognize, from the child side, you recognize that your parents are people and they're fallible and they have all these, and it's different than what happens in high school, because you see that in high school too, but it's different because you're still in their house, you still follow the rules. So part of me feels like one of the lessons of this story is, like, this all happens without a backstory. We don't see what Lear and his daughters go through before that, but I know what I went through with you and mom.
Right.
And, if you guys have done the work for the first 20 years of my life and you've built a foundation of love and kindness and I'll say trust, specifically like you have shown me that you trust me, I think this kind of stuff doesn't happen. You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
when the crisis hits, you're ready for it.
I think those are great points. And another thing that occurs to me is like, what are the goals? I think in this plot of King Lear, the goal is the perpetuation of this family rule of
Hmm.
Britain, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. For sure.
Lear is also including within that goal, oh yeah, and my 100 knights and my privileges. Right? And I think in a healthy family relationship, the goal is the success of the children, the growth of the
Yeah.
children. Now,
Yeah. Definitely.
it is also, that mom and I have a nest egg and that we're able to retire and that we're able to do the things that we need to do and want to do. Are those sort of, competing, economic interests and those kinds of things that we do have to be careful with, the way we plan our future. But the main goal for a healthy parent-child relationship is for you guys, the kids, to grow and to leave the nest and to graduate from college and to have the skills and the networks that are needed to be able to become self-sufficient, self-reliant, productive members of society. And so, like you say, I mean, there's a lot of backstory that goes into raising kids that we don't see in Lear and is maybe either not realistic or I think we can learn from sort of the dysfunction of Lear and not recreate that in kind of a healthy family situation.
Yeah, yeah. I'll maybe throw one more tidbit in there about that. One of the most repeated phrases in this play is Lear saying, "I gave you all." He
That's
says
right.
that to all of his daughters.
It's
And
in a it's in a Mumford and Sons song.
it is.
Yeah,
And like the subtext follow up to that is either, "And this is how you treat me," or, "So you owe me all." And it's sort of the opposite of what you just said. Lear makes it about himself.
yeah,
He takes this approach of, "You owe me because of what I have given you." And I don't know, I've been talking to my wife Nikki about this a lot. We've been workshopping this and we've been talking about this idea of whether or not children owe their parents anything. And I think that question is really profoundly asked in this play. I don't know the answer, I'll be honest. I mean, to some extent, everybody owes everyone else something. I owe the beggar on the street kindness, and I owe my neighbor respect. And so I owe my parents that as well. I owe you guys that. But is there more to it? I think parents definitely owe their children things. They owe their children the best job that they can do. But I do think that there is a point to be made that Lear believes that his children owe him something that they maybe don't feel they owe him themselves.
that's so interesting that this mismatch in expectations or
Exactly.
assumptions. I'm not going to be able to find it right now. I didn't write this down in the notes. We could do probably 2 or 3 episodes on this play. It's so deep.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned this at the beginning that Lear is sort of a mythical king, and the setting of King Lear is actually pre-Christian.
Mhm.
And so you get them talking about the gods, right? You don't have direct Christian references in King Lear as you do in some of Shakespeare's plays, but you do have some very interesting references to the commandments. Poor Tom, no, I'm sorry, Edgar.
Edgar.
I'm
Edgar.
getting them mixed up. Edgar, the son of Gloucester,
The
when he is
legitimate.
the legitimate son of Gloucester, when he's pretending to be a crazy guy and hiding from his father and from the Duke of Cornwall, who's hunting him down. He pretends to be a crazy guy, spreads mud on his face and stuff. Anyway, he quotes the fourth commandment, which is to honor your father and mother.
Mhm.
So some of the Christian, and of course, Shakespeare's audience would have been very familiar with, the basic 10 commandments. And so that Shakespeare was playing around with that and this
Yeah.
question of what do you owe your parents? You do owe, in the Christian theology, a duty of honor, right? But how far does it go? And sort of behavior does that also presuppose for a father or a mother to, to owe to their children as well? I think those are very interesting questions, and Shakespeare's so good at sort of playing around with that stuff.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about this play is how well he works the contradictory in, kind of I think we're both fans of Walt Whitman, but this idea of I contain multitudes. A lot of the characters in this play are more than one thing, like people are. My favorite, my favorite example of this is that the Duke of Kent, I'll say this quickly, but it's great. The Duke of Kent is banished, and then he comes back in disguise, and he comes back to Lear because he loves Lear and he wants to serve him. And so Lear doesn't recognize him, and he asks him, "What good are you? What can you do for me?" He's in disguise, and he says, "I can keep honest counsel,
Yeah.
run, ride, mar a curious tale in telling it, and deliver a plain message bluntly." So he's talking about honesty, blunt messages. The mar a curious tale is like he can mess up a complicated tale by telling it simply, but all of it's complex, and he's in disguise the whole time. He's
Yeah,
like lying about it.
yeah,
It's great. So, like, Shakespeare does this thing where he has these characters who are walking contradictions or walking opposites in and of themselves. And it's the same thing, right? It's like, should you love your parents unconditionally? Probably, but then also no. And should you love your children unconditionally? Again, yes, unless they try to kill you and kill your other kids. And it's all about these contradictions, these paradoxes, and then having the ability of discernment to kind of cut through to the quick of the thing.
yeah. Another great example is Edmund, who, his first soliloquy, he appeals to the gods of nature, right? He says, "Nature, thou art my goddess," right? I
Right.
was born a bastard, and so I'm going to appeal to my baser. You call me base. Society calls me base, a bastard. I'll appeal to my baser nature, and then I will do whatever is necessary to gain power. If society is going to push me down and call me base, then I will behave as society defines me. I'll do
Yeah.
anything I need to gain power. And then later, when Gloucester is reading in an almanac about that there are evil stars and the moon is in a bad phase and things are happening that are like, and he's attributing to astrology, basically, all of the weird things that are happening and what's going on with Lear, Edmund then makes fun of that and says, "Oh, every time something bad happens, you attribute it to some natural phenomenon. That's so silly." It's exactly what you're talking about, this
Yeah.
contradiction where he's attributing his own bad behavior to his base nature. Nothing I can do. Nothing I can
Yep.
do. I'm a bastard. And yet my father is attributing all of these sort of, scary, kind of evil events to, kind of the motion of the stars. What a silly old man. It's just these contradictions that we're getting
Yeah.
kind of down in the weeds on Shakespearean interpretation now.
Yeah. No,
It's
but
too fun.
I think it applies to what we're talking about here, which is the relationship between parents and children. The longer I'm a dad, the more I realize kind of how I mean, I say contradictory things to River all the time, And I am both exhausted and overwhelmed and also like just so in love with this tiny human at the same time. And I think that what I have been able to take from the tragedy of this play is that, the good guys who are just one thing, they die. They don't win. And the bad guys who are just one thing, they die and they don't win either. I mean, the ones who if you want to find winners in this play, I think it's Lear and Gloucester who believe one thing at the beginning and learn something at the end. And the only way they do that is by being willing to like think through what's happening in their situation. I said a few minutes ago, I don't know what the answer is to some of these questions, but I think you have to recognize that you don't know the answer and like think through it and like be open to you have to try to discern the correct response to any given situation.
Well, that's a good segue to perhaps a next question, which I think is a pretty tough one, actually,
Yeah.
which is the question about honesty and unconditional love, right?
Mhm.
I think we kind of batted this one back and forth, but one of the questions I have had about this play from the very beginning is why didn't Cordelia just sort of say, Okay,
Okay,
fine.
dad.
Okay,
Yeah,
I know my kids have done that. Okay, dad, when I've gone on a rant and I've said, "Yeah,
yeah,
the Federalist Papers say that without faction shall not blah, blah, blah." Okay, dad, and because you don't wanna hear another tirade, another
yeah,
lecture, even though maybe you don't quite agree, you just sort of say, "Okay, dad, I love you to the moon and back, and can I just have my third? It'll be better for everybody in the long run. It will reduce bloodshed." Why didn't she do that? Why did she feel that it was so important to be honest and have that integrity? Wouldn't it have been better? And, then what does that teach us about integrity, honesty in family relationships? Some families are very open with each other. I mean, your Bailey side of the family is very sort of loud. The other side of your family is a little less, open about certain types of things. Is one better than the other?
yeah. I know. I think that's a great question, and this will maybe be our last question for the pod today. Just for running up on time, but I do want to add one quick piece of context. So a little bit more about the backstory of King Lear. Right, we talked about how it's kind of mythic in origins, and in the original myth, this love test is set up in a very similar way, but in the myth, Cordelia is it's kind of set up as a way for Lear to gain some leverage over Cordelia so that he can choose her husband. He has a preference. I don't remember which is which, but he has a preference between her husband choices.
Burgundy
But
in
it's still
France.
up to her. Yeah, but it's still up to her um, as far as who she's going to choose. So what he does is he tries to set up this like test, and his idea is that if he can get her to respond in a certain way, he can then leverage that into choosing her husband. And what she chooses to do is just not to play the game. She just doesn't play, and so he can't do his thing. He can't choose her husband, and she gets to choose who she wants. But Shakespeare purposefully left that out. He purposefully leaves it vague as to what both Lear's motivations are and Cordelia's motivations are. He didn't want, at least from what I could tell from my research, there wasn't kind of that same baggage. And so we've talked a little bit about Lear. I personally think that there's a lot to do with like Lear's fear. He does this because he has this fear of oblivion and losing his legacy. Cordelia, though, is harder for me to suss out. I mean, maybe she's just a representative character, like a foil in some ways for
Yeah.
Lear.
Yeah. It's a plot device in some
Yeah,
ways. Sure.
yeah. But I do think that there's something to be said as well for like, a child who's willing to stand up to a parent who's kind of throwing a tantrum at the end of their lives. There's a line in there, a great line where the fool talks about how Lear has made his daughters his mothers.
Yeah.
And there's some of that, like as you age, and I mean, you're closer to this than I am. Yours and mom's parents are closer to Lear's age, I think, but your parents start to in some ways have to take care of them and, be a parent figure to your parents. And so Cordelia is, I think, sort of taking on a similar role in this scene. She's being like the buck stops with me. We're not going to do this ridiculous thing that you want to do.
Yeah, but there are more than one way to do that.
Yeah,
And,
for sure.
persuasion, and you sort of have to stay in the game to be able to do that. Um, just thinking about those sort of elder care issues that we do have in our own family, kindness and gentleness. And sometimes you do have to sort of put up with a certain amount of, and I'm sure you'll have to put up with this too. I'm not making any judgments.
Oh, we already are. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. Putting up with a certain level of unreasonableness, of
Mhm.
fear, as you get older. I'm,
Yeah,
read-
for sure.
I'm reading a book right now by Daniel Mendelsohn, who just translated a new translation of the Odyssey. And he writes a book about his father when he was old and how afraid he was of falling all the
Mm.
time. And that's becomes a real fear for an older person. And so an older person that becomes part of the decision-making process. And so, a young person, who's 35, who's 45, doesn't understand that fear, probably,
Yeah.
may intellectually, but not viscerally. I don't know. I don't know that I have anything sort of really groundbreaking or useful to say. I just wonder if sometimes you have to sort of say, "Okay, dad, that's all right. Yeah, that's whatever you say."
I think that is important. I think that is important, especially from, we often study Shakespeare when we're young. Most people, I would say, do. And you have a tendency to look for the good guys in the story. And, when I read this when I was in college, I was like, oh, Cordelia's the good guy. Cordelia and Kent, they're the good guys. But at the same time, the story would never have happened if Cordelia hadn't been, in some ways, flippant about her father's last request as king,
Right. Right.
Even her response, she doesn't just say, "Dad, I love you as much as I should." Her first response, he says, "What do you say, Cordelia?" And she says, "Nothing."
Nothing. Yeah.
And that's probably his biggest fear, right? Is nothing, is fading into oblivion. That's why he wants
Oblivion.
to keep his knights. That's why he wants to keep the title of king. And so sometimes I think that is important. I think you do have to, as your parents age, they did that for you when you were a squealing babe, when you were a toddler and you needed reassurance. And so the least you can do maybe sometimes is do that for them as they are growing old themselves.
As frustrating as it can be, and it can be. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that that's the answer. I just think it's something worth it's something worth thinking about. Not
Yeah,
lying, but patience.
patience. Yeah, it's case by case. It always will be, but
Can we talk about one more thing, and
yeah,
we'll see if this makes the cut. I mean, we can
let's do
always
it.
edit.
Yeah.
There's one other thing you and I talked about, which I just has bugged me about this play for the first time. I mean, I've probably encountered this play. This is probably the third time I've encountered this play in a serious way. Where are all the moms, Luke?
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that until you wrote that question down. And it's like sort of shocking, kind of breaks you out of the suspended disbelief of the story, but where are they? And this wouldn't have happened with moms in it, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, you know,
Maybe.
you can write you can write the script. Obviously,
Yeah.
medieval or Renaissance England, women died in childbirth. There were diseases. There was plague. Obviously, people there were holes in the roster all over the place in families. It's not the fact that there are people missing from families. It's just that there doesn't seem to be there's an incompleteness to the family unit that seems to show in the relationships to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And maybe throwing one more piece in there, none of Lear's daughters are mothers themselves.
Right.
And I do think there is something. So, maybe preface, I am very sensitive to people who want to be married and are not, want to be parents and can't.
Yeah.
And I don't think that anyone has a life that is any less valuable because they don't have a traditional family unit. But that said, maybe not but, and, and that said, having a child shifts the way you think about family like I don't think anything else can. I just
Yeah.
don't think it's possible. And I wonder if Goneril had had a child or had some children, or Regan had had some children, would that have changed the way that they viewed their aging father? And would they maybe have behaved a little bit differently? I don't know, but maybe.
Yeah. I also think about, I just had an experience where I needed to get some medical care. And I don't know that I would have ever made the appointment had Melinda, your mom, my wife,
Yeah.
not helped me do that. Now, maybe I would. And that's, in some ways, that's a cop out. And I know that. But she and I are partners.
Mhm.
And I do some of those same things for her. She's just better at it than I am. There's a partnership in parenting, I think, that, you know, that can help uh, moderate some of the mistakes that one or the other may be prone to make. We started the conversation talking about the backstory, like what was the relationship between this father and these daughters going back? Why was that foundation not there? How did this father treat these daughters that led to this kind of dysfunction? And it seems sort of, at least to be suggestive to me, that there was no partner there, no mother there, no other parent there that could help to moderate, to soften, to question, to push back against some of what could have been excessive.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's a great point. I mean, the one time they mention mothers is when Gloucester is introducing Edmund to Kent, and he speaks in just the most sort of gratuitous. I mean, he talks about Edmund's mother in a terrible way.
Yeah.
That's the only time they talk about them.
Objectifying to totally.
Yeah, yeah,
It's it's funny in a body kind of way, and, you take the good with the bad, with Shakespeare. I mean, it's sort of like a Seinfeld episode. It's pretty funny, but afterwards, you're kinda like, "That really was not very respectful."
no, not at all. And it's one of the things that drives Edmund to his nefarious ends,
That's right.
to his antagonistic antics. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the lesson there's so many lessons in Lear, and I think it's probably the play that he wrote that can be interpreted in the most ways. You know,
Bold
Lear
sta
can be a good guy or a bad guy. I believe it.
bold statement.
Yeah.
Bold statement from Luke Bailey. It's a good one to probably a good one to end on.
Yeah. But I mean, at the end of the day, build a solid foundation with your family, be partners with them, and you'll end up better than they do.
That's right,
Better
and
than
I
Lear.
I agree with you that both Lear and Gloucester end up better. They both die.
Yep.
Lear's blind at the beginning and he sees at the end. Gloucester is blind at the end, but I think he learns something, definitely about love and about his sons. So I guess that's in a Shakespeare tragedy anyway. That's take the wins where you can get where
About
you
as good as you can get. I agree. All right. Well, thanks again, Dad. This was a good one.
love you, son.
Love you too. We'll talk to you later.